And I was struck by Professor Costell's comments about the fact the internet is now and not wow. In fact, I think there's a good article title in there somewhere, From Wow to Now. But I'm also very conscious that it's something which is accepted as being perfectly normal and day-to-day by many people. And indeed, my son is amongst that number. He's a digital native, and he treats the internet and broadband connection rather like breathing. So if broadband is cut off, it's as though he's lost his human rights and his oxygen supply. So I have a lot of sympathy with the principle adopted there, and that in fact the internet's part of everyday life, I think, is witness to a trip I made to Sweden yesterday, where today it is e-commerce day in Sweden. I was at the Textile High School in the University of Borås, which is near Gothenburg, and they gave me as a gift a pair of eye gloves. Okay? So it's too warm to wear them here. But in Sweden, you know, trying to get a combination of the internet and cold weather with touchscreen phones is quite challenging. And here we have a pair of smart gloves with tips that will work on an iPhone. Okay, whereas regular gloves won't. So we can see the internet is woven quite literally into our everyday lives. I'm going to stand up to do this because I can't talk sitting down, so I hope the camera will forgive me for doing this. And I want to talk specifically this morning about some of the contrasts between European markets in respect of e-commerce. I also want to comment on these issues critically, because I think for too long we have relied upon what we might call top-line numbers in relation to e-commerce, a preoccupation with online, and I think as Professor Castell's quite rightly said, we're not talking about simply clicks, it's bricks and clicks, whatever we want to talk about. The most awful word I've just discovered is being now used as omni-channel, which I think is a terrible word, and I shall not use it anymore this morning. But I think it's the reflection of to some extent, the attempt by many commentators to suggest that the internet will replace everything that has gone before. Whereas what we know from previous experience is that we find such phenomena play a complementary role in relation to other phenomena within economy and society. And as we look at, across Europe, the way in which e-commerce has rolled out, the way in which firms have adapted to this, we can see that this complementarity rather than substitution is something that has become a very important part of business models and strategy over the last few years. So, what are my credentials for talking about this? In Oxford, we have, as Inma has said, a research centre focused on retailing. I've been there 25 years, and it's worked really as the bridge between the work of scholars thinking about questions important to retailing and the practical needs of the sector itself internationally. We work through students, through managers within companies, as well as through research projects, both academic and applied. And much of our applied research captures many of the themes that we're going to be talking about today. In particular, innovation and entrepreneurship. Retailing, as we know, is one of the most innovative, exciting sectors in terms of its creativity, in terms of the froth of innovation that takes place. We focus also on retail planning and development, on supply chain management, but particularly on technology and retailing. Indeed, my doctoral supervisor, Ross Davis, was responsible for what I think was the first European e-commerce project in 1980. This is a scheme put together for Tesco, the UK's largest retailer, and was actually based on a TV screen about this size, in a large cabinet, using a technology called videotex. And in 1980 to 82, that was providing grocery goods for elderly and disadvantaged shoppers in the northeast of England. And it was one of the first, I think, pioneering schemes of this kind. So it's been around a while, although the names have changed, of course. So we work in a whole variety of applied research areas and also in teaching. So within the business school, we have a full-time MBA program, and around about half our students will do a retailing elective course as part of that program. But I'm here today to talk a bit about e-commerce contrasts. And I was struck by a comment of a former Cambridge colleague, so it seems rather strange to have a Cambridge University citation here. But John Norton, who was at Cambridge until very recently, and he's left now, so I can mention him, talks about the internet as a global surprise generation machine. He says, if I've learned one thing from watching the internet over 2 decades, it's this: prediction is futile. The reason is laughably simple. The network's architecture and lack of central control effectively makes it a global surprise generation machine. Since its inception, it's enabled disruptive innovation at a blistering pace. And I think Professor Castells has kind of captured in his own writing and his comments this morning many of those kinds of challenges and paradoxes and dilemmas that we face in dealing with this particular phenomenon. How have retailers dealt with this phenomenon? Well, it's very interesting to see 12 years ago, the chairman of one of our biggest UK retailers, Marks and Spencer, Sir Richard Greenbury, who was a very successful business leader, a very successful retailer, traditional retailer, a bricks and mortar retailer. And he said in 2000, in Britain, I would wager that most of all of our customers live within an hour's travel of a Marks and Spencer store. The internet hasn't had the same impact on clothing and department store retailers here. Why switch when there's nothing onerous about the current situation? The benefits of e-commerce are simply not as immediately apparent here. And clearly, he hadn't read many of the sorts of things that certainly we and others were writing about the way in which, at a certain scale, these kinds of phenomena could transform the way in which consumers manage their buying processes. But he was quite specific. Maybe luxury clothing will never sell online. The importance of fit and feel, the personal input of a salesperson, can't be offset by even the best electronic service. But notice he's talking about trade-offs here. He's not talking about substitutes. He's talking about a complementary role. He still sees a role for stores. But then he says, well, commodities like white knickers, white pants, why not? So he could see a space for commodities, but he couldn't see a space on the internet for high margin, high service, high experience products. And at that time, many people agreed with him. We saw a lot of failures at that time. There was a European operation. Again, I was in Sweden, met one of the former founders, Boo.com, many of you may remember, which failed dismally, trying to sell clothing electronically. And yet today, we have a company in the UK which was founded at the same year that Greenbury made his comments, called ASOS, which is now the second biggest online clothing retailer in the UK and turns over, not just from the UK, but from international markets, £500 million in turnover, from 50,000 lines, and internationally is now taking around about 2/3 of its sales from outside the UK market, with over 3 million customers. That transformation over that 12-year period, I think, in a sector which was regarded as being really hard to move in any way online, other than for commodities, I think is very indicative of some of the things that businesses have had to come to terms with in that period. Something else they had to come to terms with is the breakdown of costs that arises from running a purely online retailer as against a typical store-based retailer. And we can see that whilst actually this is a typical specialty apparel store company, which I've put alongside the ASOS figures to make it more comparable, staff level costs are around about the same. The real saving is actually on real estate, so warehousing is a lot cheaper, and is on, other operating costs is higher for the store retailer. Store occupancy costs, 12%. That's what really makes the difference in terms of the cost base. So actually many of the operational costs are not dissimilar in terms of scale, although their incidence is slightly different. So when companies are thinking about how to develop their e-commerce operations, they find themselves in a position where they have to make some hard choices. And when a bricks and mortar retailer tries to become a multi-channel or an omni-channel retailer, so we find that this conflicting cost structure can cause significant difficulties in their operational requirements. Now, as scholars and academics, we have written a lot about the internet and about e-commerce. I'd like to think we've moved from wow to now, although there are still a lot of wow articles around, far too many, I think. And the lag in actually producing learned articles in the leading journals often means that we are seen as being behind the curve on some of these kinds of questions. For me, I think what's really interesting as a geographer, that's my original background discipline, is some of the ways in which markets for e-commerce differ. I know here in Spain, there's been a continuing interest in trying to explain why, for example, certain European markets with very similar economic and technological levels of development to others appear not to have achieved the same degree of penetration of online activity than others. So let me turn to some of those sorts of questions. I want to illustrate in the next quarter of an hour or so some of the possible reasons behind this. I'll do a selection of a number of small reasons which I think are indicative of why we see some differences across the continent. If we think about internet sales as a whole around the world, the latest estimates are around about 400 billion euros, depending on which source one uses. And again, sources and methods become important here. We start to find competing sources, competing estimates. Do we include tickets? Do we exclude tickets? Quantifying the scale of e-commerce activity is a fundamental challenge. It'll become even more fundamental as online sales start to become part of the integrated revenue of a business in ways that make it hard to pull apart the element that has come from online and the element from offline. And we know as scholars that, of course, that is being made significantly more complex by the way in which consumers are largely channel independent in terms of hopping from channel to channel, from platform to platform, as it suits them through the information, research, and buying process. It makes it very hard to attribute sales to any one channel over another. But let's suspend our critical judgment just for a moment and say that worldwide sales are around about 400 to 500 billion euros. About a third of that was from the US. China is now number 2 in respect of total amount, according to this particular source, followed by Japan, the UK, Germany, France, South Korea, Brazil, and so on. So we can actually see that something like 3/4 of the global internet sales that we have seen measured through this particular source come from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 countries in terms of absolute scale. However, we also need to take account of some of the drivers of this growth. And here's one attempt to do that. This comes from the European Commission's data on use of the internet for buying goods and services. So it's a different source from the previous one. And one of the main drivers that we know of e-commerce is the penetration of broadband in the home. That's what we're told by economists and commentators. I have some suspicions, actually, this is no longer as reliable a guide as it used to be because of the growth of mobile. Nevertheless, there seems to be quite a good fit between the proportion of households having broadband access in 2011 and those spending something on internet purchases in the last 12 months. But both these are very crude measures. What do we mean by broadband? It's a movable feast. It's defined for the purposes of this survey, but actually we already know that the European Commission has very ambitious plans for broadband over the next few years. So are we measuring the right thing? Internet purchase in the last 12 months, that doesn't tell us how much was spent, it doesn't tell us on what. It simply says, I bought something. It could be anything. It might have been a book, it might have been a car. Who knows? Nevertheless, there does seem to be a reasonably close correlation. And so we find, for example, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Nordic markets, very much at the top right-hand corner here. The UK is also in that group, as is Germany. We see a kind of middle group here around France, Luxembourg, Belgium. And we see a group here, including Spain, Poland, the Czech Republic. And then we see in the tail here, Bulgaria, Romania, moving up. How useful is this kind of information? Well, frankly, not terribly useful. I think what we find from this is that certainly we can find good correlations, 81% explanation of this, but frankly what lies behind this is very dubious data, data which perhaps is being captured at different years, and perhaps is not very helpful in terms of understanding some of those differences. Another way of looking at this, amounts spent online. Using the same data as the pie chart I showed you earlier, it would appear that the UK, typical adult online in the UK, spends more than anybody else in the world online in a typical year, around about 600 euros per capita per annum. More even than Finland and the US. In fact, the Finns think that's too high. I think that's a bit too high for the UK. Higher than the US, higher than Denmark and Switzerland in terms of absolute amounts spent. So we can measure e-commerce in a variety of ways, none of which are entirely satisfactory. We can look at the geography of e-commerce, and here's the way the European Commission looks at it on a country-by-country basis. And it tells us apparently there's a north-south divide in terms of the propensity to buy goods and services by internet, phone, or post. They've included a whole variety of channels here to think about. So let's think a little bit about some of the explanations of possible contrasts that have their grounding in scholarship and inquiry that is more critical and more measured than some of these top-line figures so beloved of the consultants. I've chosen to look at demand-side contrasts and supply-side contrasts, and I've pulled out a couple in each case to try and illustrate how complex some of these drivers and differences may be, but also how much they play a long-standing legacy role in influencing adoption of e-commerce. So let's look at demand-side contrasts first, and I want to divide these between economic and socio-cultural. Many of the scholars here in Spain in particular have been very interested in some of the cultural explanations for differential penetration of e-commerce across European markets. But I want to look at economic factors first, because I think here we can start to see, in particular most recently, some of the ways in which business responses have been customized around the geography of demand and the economic characteristics of that demand. So if you think about the geography of demand, if we go below the national level and look at what's called the NUTS 2 regions of the EU, which is the next level down, the regions within countries, we start to see a slightly more complex picture. As a geographer, these kinds of exercises are very difficult because it depends on how you set the boundaries. These are administrative boundaries. They're not functional boundaries in any way. But they start to give us a feel for the fact, for example, for broadband penetration, Nordic markets have made the decision in what are often very complex geographies, highly concentrated in urban areas, and then a very remote and a very sparsely populated hinterland, to ensure that these hinterland regions are well connected. That's not been the case so much in southern Europe. We see for Italy, significant undersupply of broadband in southern Italy, and a north-south divide very much in that country. In the UK too, we can see certainly broadband penetration is very strong in the south and east, and in Scotland, where the national government in Scotland has been very keen to invest in broadband capability. But much less so in the southwest of England, where there is still a good deal of rural poverty, and where also older households have taken to retiring and have less apparent need for those sorts of facilities. If we map that onto buying products, we see a different picture. Again, Nordic markets, particularly Norway, spending their oil money on lots of goods online throughout the country. We see a very different picture, though. It's a slightly more complex picture. We see higher penetration in Spain than for broadband. In the UK, we see a much broader picture across the piece. But something like Belgium, for example, is like a hole in the donut. E-commerce spending in Belgium is well down in what we would expect, given broadband penetration within that marketplace. And it's pretty uniform across the country. I was talking to some Belgian retailers about this recently. Their explanation was, well, the price, the access price to broadband is actually very high in Belgium, as is all communications costs by comparison with European averages. And that's seen as being something of a barrier to consumers. And on the supply side, we see a very densely provided for retail market within Belgium, which has made it less necessary, perhaps, for retailers there to compete in an online way. So we have some interesting issues around the geography of demand, and geographers across Europe have been looking at the way in which we measure these sorts of phenomena with some degree of success. The second example is price sensitivity. And I take two practical examples here, although, again, the scholarship is well established in thinking about the role of price sensitivity amongst consumers in favouring or otherwise particular kinds of e-commerce propositions. And the best example of this is seen in some of the private buying clubs that have sprung up across Europe, particularly in markets that are under economic pressure. And so here in France, for example, we have venteprivé.com, founded in 2001, and it's now in the US with working with Amex and 7 other European markets. It runs private sales events and it has been profitable for a number of years, very, very successfully so, as the segment in France who are most price sensitive see that as a way of getting bargains and branded fashion goods at good prices. And of course here in Spain, with the more recent growth of Privalia, we see an increasingly successful business, fantastic growth, 90% growth in sales over that period, but particularly 2010 to 11, as economic conditions worsen, we start to see people scrambling to hear about the bargains that are available in these private sales. And so what we find is operations like Amazon Buy VIP and Privalia and Vente Privée are business responses to price sensitivity differences across the region. So, for example, in the UK, we don't have price clubs to the same extent, although Vente Privée is actually present in the UK. It hasn't been as successful. Interestingly, in the UK, it's actually a store-based business that has been most successful in delivering discount clothing. Secondly, socio-cultural factors. And on the demand side here, the 2 areas that have been of most interest, I think, over the last few years in terms of academic scholarship have been concerns about attitudes to trust and payment, and secondly, work on cumulative experience and word of mouth, and, if you like, the snowballing effect of that word of mouth. So attitudes to trust and payment is a very rich source of scholarly work, it seems to me. And in particular, thinking about some of these kinds of structural equation models or technology adoption models where perhaps trust and concerns on privacy are part of the mix. This comes from Casala's work. But it reflects very much a kind of common view on the way this whole set of relationships works. If we start to cast that back to some of the empirical work on levels of trust in other activities across Europe, I've just pulled out, again, some European Commission data on trust, first of all, in shops and department stores for last year, and trust in internet service companies for 5 national markets and for Europe as a whole. And it's hard to read, even from the front here, and from the back it's impossible. But basically, the darker the colour, the larger the darker bars, the more trust there is in those particular institutions. So, for example, we find in the UK, the highest levels of trust of those 5 countries, 44%, 48% trust totally, or tend to trust, shops and department stores, compared to a figure that's as low as 34% in Germany, and something similar in France. So there's a greater trustworthiness of the retail brand, if you like, in the UK. We know that from our academic analysis. It's borne out by some of the statistical analysis that the Commission and others have undertaken. If you look at internet service companies, trust levels are generally much lower. And again, it's the UK that tends to be the most trusting, although not by any means as much as it is for retail stores. And we have around about 30% who totally trust or tend to trust, and probably they're being a bit too trusting from my point of view, of internet service companies. But it's certainly a significant proportion compared to, again, France, where we have about 16% totally trust or tend to trust the internet service company idea. And when we come on to attitudes to payment as a consequence of this, we need to understand, well, why are trust levels different? Why are trust levels in Germany so low? What's going on underneath this? One of the most interesting features in Germany, it seems to me, is around attitudes to payment and attitudes to the way in which information is used. These are cultural attitudes, well established in the literature. Attitudes to payment. If you think about the German consumer, typically conservative in payment behavior, very much focused on cash. There's an emotional link to cash in that society. Online payment systems are starting to overcome this, but only gradually. And at the moment, for example, in Germany for last year, only 7.5% of transactions were settled by credit card, compared to 45% in France, 56% in Germany, in the UK. And This overcomplex chart, I think, shows all the European countries, but has Germany around about here in terms of its use of credit cards and the growth over time. So it's slowly growing, but by comparison with, let's say, the US and Finland, which is the grey line is the US, the purple is Finland, twice as many non-cash transactions per inhabitant, according to the bank's measure there. So we see a very kind of conservative, culturally configured attitude towards the use of cash, only slowly being overcome by the use of some of the newer mechanisms like click and buy, PayPal, and near-field communications on smartphones. I'm going to just skip this bit because time is getting away. Cumulative experience and word of mouth is the second cultural factor. And all I'll say there is really to show you haven't seen this yet, the iPhone 10, okay? Which is coming to a shop near you soon, or coming to a website near you soon where you can buy it. But, of course, what has really transformed the European experience of e-commerce is not just the growth of conventional e-commerce through residential use, through workplace use, but, of course, the ubiquitous mobility of devices like these, where adoption rates run between 30% in Germany, which again is quite low, to 54-55% in Norway for smartphone penetration. Spain, this particular data from Google, has it about 44%. I think it's slightly higher than that, actually. But what the mobility piece does is provide the glue, which binds all other channels together, and provides for individuals to talk about cumulative experience and to demonstrate that. How many of you have been at dinners or parties where people get involved in an app war? You know, they say, "Have you seen this app?" You know, "Let me show you this app. It's a really wonderful app." "Oh, but have you seen this app?" You know. So there is competition for demonstrating how wonderful you are at using these kinds of devices, but also in talking about the experiences that you've had. So rather than the UK, rather than going down to the pub and talking about your new car, you talk about the new app that you've found, Angry Birds or whatever. So the word of mouth effects have a cumulative effect. And we know from research on word of mouth more generally, but even pre-internet, that this is a very powerful cultural mechanism. And I think there's a significant need for more scholarship in this area. I know Anna's work on the effect on brand sentiment, for example, we're going to hear about it later, I think is a very powerful part of that research. Supply side. And I think here we see a need amongst academics to try and understand more systematically and strategically the way in which businesses are dealing with some of these kinds of contrasts across Europe in particular. The framework I find most useful is that from Zhang, 2010, who talks about a series of multi-channel challenges, and they're broken down into 4 categories: organizational strategy and skills, data integration, consumer analytics, evaluation and performance metrics. And I'll talk a little bit about a couple of those as we conclude this section. But I also wanted to talk about this final line here: actions of a few large firms. Not really captured in this piece at all. I did a lot of work in Finland, where you would think there would be a large degree of multi-channel retail activity, but there isn't. Why not? Well, there are 2 very large businesses that dominate the Finnish market. It's highly concentrated, the S Group and the K Group. Neither of those businesses have been particularly bullish on investing, bold on investing in e-commerce. They've chosen not to make very significant investments. They see it as very costly. And in a sense, if those 2 dominant players choose not to make those investments, it's hard for others to justify doing it. And so the competition in Finland has been from new entrants coming into the market. So sometimes the actions of a few large firms that may dominate a retail market can influence very significantly the way in which that market will develop. In the UK, I contrast that with, for example, say Tesco, Marks & Spencer, that did make some very big investments, and others were forced to follow. They led, consumers captured that initiative, in fact took it over by and large, and consumers are now leading that. But it was the individual firms that kicked that off. Here's a perspective on the organizational strategy piece, which is about, I think, again, there's a need for some work here. There's not much work on organizational structure and design for e-commerce, but one of the things that does come out is what is holding back many European retailers is their governance structure, the nature of their organizations. So there's some businesses on this chart, Intermarché, Leclerc, and so on, which are organized largely as either cooperatives or as federations of independently owned small businesses. And that creates real challenges for integration. It creates challenges for organizational coherence when you need a seamless organization to deliver multi-channel retailing. Secondly, skills. We also find that organizations complain that there are insufficient skills available for their e-commerce or multi-channel needs. And this is an exercise which the European Union did, asking what individuals whether they thought their skills in ICT were insufficient for the labour market or not, if they had to change jobs. And 34% of Italians, for example, of employable age, felt that their skills were insufficient to be employable in ICT jobs. Compare that to 7% for the Netherlands, or 8% for Sweden, 11% for the UK. Spain is 28%, which is also quite high. So again, there's a constraint in terms of the ability to find and employ skilled, technically skilled staff. And finally, culture. The Zappos example has been well documented and well talked about, now owned by Amazon. But that wow culture is something that is hard sometimes to align with conventional retail culture. My time is getting away from me, so I'm just going to finish with a couple of brief points. The issues around the ways in which consumers, the ways in which operations works on e-commerce are equally significant across the continent. And so that we start to see that many existing retail store systems are 10 years or more old. Very difficult to justify often investments any more frequently than that in many economies. So during the recession, the average UK retailer spent less than 1% of its turnover on new IT systems. So one of Zhang's issues around data integration becomes much more difficult as a consequence. And customer insight is another consideration. And here we see the Tesco example, where Tesco is now tracking not just the touch points that consumers now work through. This is something we've been talking about as academics for many years. Tesco has kind of now grasped this and is trying to model this by channel and by activity, but also tracking actual behavior. So this is the .com contribution to sales across the day in Tesco stores, hourly sales. And the .com piece is in red. And you can see that the .com contribution is primarily between 6 in the morning and kind of 1 o'clock in terms of hourly sales. So often it's people on their way to work. It's people using work-based computers to order goods for delivery later on in the day. And .com sales, as a percentage of the hour, peaks at 7 in the morning, which is interesting. Now, at the moment, Tesco also tracks its vans, so it can optimize its delivery systems. It has a joined-up inventory control system. So there's an app here that you can get called Tesco Finder, where you can go into a store and it will tell you for that named store where an item is on the shelf. And this particular bottle of vinegar is aisle 3 on the left side, counting 2 units along, and then the 8th shelf up from the floor. So what lies behind that is a complete mastery of inventory control. Yeah? And that carries through to the
quarter. Growth should continue at the current rate, which...
Tell me that you love me.
Sorry.
The free Tesco grocery app lets you order from your iPhone and has a new barcode scanner so you can pop products into your online basket in one click.
Oh, hang on. I'm going to order a bottle for home.
Excuse me. We've run out of those too.
From your scan to our van, Tesco.com. Every little helps.
At the moment, mobile commerce through Tesco is accounting for 12% of its online sales in the UK. So, and that's growing quite significantly. So this is now a much more widespread phenomenon. The final piece on supply side is the power of large incumbents to influence change. And we see here from Amazon, Jeff Bezos quoted as saying, "We are culturally pioneers. We like to disrupt even our own business." Not least the profitability of its business, I think. Other companies have different cultures and sometimes don't like to do that. Our job is to bring those industries along. Isn't that nice? So here we now have Amazon starting to colonize much of Europe, opening in Italy, in Spain, country-only sites, and doing the same kind of thing that we've been talking about this morning, which is thinking about some of the cultural differences between particular markets and developing propositions for those markets. So this is a chart which Amazon used to have up until about 2004, which we've carried on updating. But it shows where, in each national market, Amazon has chosen to introduce particular categories of goods. We can now add France, Spain, and Germany and Italy to that mix. As, for example, they decide that China can have tools and hardware, but Italy can't yet. So that kind of thinking that companies are now going through, Amazon in particular, I think starts to display that companies are now taking very seriously the challenge that e-commerce poses. So I'm going to conclude not with the digital agenda for Europe, which is rather boring, but I'm going to conclude with this, which is the practical outcomes of many things I've described. What we're now facing in the UK is very much a perfect storm, where economic conditions, the growth of supermarkets out of town, and the growth of e-commerce is leading to a substantial restructuring of the retail offer in the UK marketplace. Here's an example from electrical retailing, where we only now have one major competitor in this space that has stores, which is Dixons. Comet, which is the second biggest retailer, went bankrupt a few weeks ago. Best Buy, which tried to open up stores in the UK, pulled out at the end of last year. Dixons is the last man standing in this situation. And throughout categories, category by category, we're seeing stores being closed, networks being rationalized, as businesses start to recognize the reality of multi-channel retailing activity. And as academics, I think what we are responsible for trying to do is to understand the dynamics of these processes. We're just about to start some work on the changing geography of retail places in the UK, for example, to look at some of the drivers of this particular change. Where we start to see, we'll see more and more of this. This is for electrical retailing, a move from where 74% of transactions took place in store to a position in a few years' time where less than half of transactions take place in store. But every channel is still important in a variety of ways in terms of its impact. And this change in number here in total is actually about the number of existing businesses trading on our downtown areas at the moment. So this is where academic thinking meets practice in terms of a genuine concern about what the geography of retail space will look like across Europe over the next 5 to 10 years. So I've overrun slightly, but I'll stop there. What I've tried to do is to draw out some of the contrasts across Europe in terms of the demand and supply side factors that affect the way in which e-commerce is delivered, drawing on some of the academic contributions that have been made in this area. There's plenty to do. There's plenty of interesting, complex ideas to explore, and there's plenty of opportunities, I think, for academics in this area to add some real value to the ways in which organizations are struggling at the moment to deal with these challenges. Thank you.